It is often said that the ideas we inherit are the ghosts of the lives we have led, that the contours of a philosopher's thought are shaped as surely by the streets they walked as by the books they read. In the case of Thomas Hobbes and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the contrast could not be more striking. One emerged from the smoldering ruins of a civil war that had torn a kingdom apart. The other grew up in a modest republic perched on the edge of the Alps, only to be driven into exile by the very societies that had nurtured his genius. To understand the philosophies that would later polarize the Enlightenment, we must first step back into the biographical and intellectual milieus that forged them, and in doing so we will hear the echo of other voices: Locke's liberal optimism, Machiavelli's pragmatic realism, even the mechanistic whisper of Descartes reverberating through their formative years. Thomas Hobbes was born in 1588, the same year that the Spanish Armada set sail for England, a year that also marked the death of the great playwright William Shakespeare. The world was already in motion, and Hobbes would grow up in a country still reeling from the aftershocks of the Reformation. His father, a modest country squire, secured for his son a place at the prestigious Westminster School, where the young Thomas first encountered the Latin classics and the rigorous discipline of a humanist curriculum. Yet it was not the dusty halls of Westminster that would leave the deepest imprint on his mind, but rather the turbulent political landscape that unfolded as he entered adulthood. In 1608, at the age of 20, Hobbes won a scholarship to Magdalen College, Oxford, a bastion of Aristotelian scholarship that, at the time, was beginning to feel the tremors of a new scientific spirit. Oxford, with its cloistered quadrangles and towering spires, was a place where the ancient texts of Aristotle and the new works of Copernicus could sit side by side. It was there that Hobbes first encountered the ideas of the great mechanist, René Descartes, whose method of doubt and emphasis on clear and distinct ideas would later resonate with Hobbes's own quest for certainty. The young scholar, however, was not content to merely absorb the teachings of his professors. He sought out the lively debates that took place in the university's coffee houses, where scholars argued the merits of atomism versus scholasticism, and where the seeds of a mechanistic worldview began to sprout. It was also at Oxford that Hobbes formed a lasting friendship with the mathematician William Petty, a relationship that would prove pivotal in the development of his political philosophy. Petty, a man of practical intellect, was fascinated by the application of mathematical principles to social and economic problems, a curiosity that Hobbes would later share in his own attempts to calculate the foundations of political order. The two men would collaborate on a series of experiments and writings, and their partnership exemplified the emerging interdisciplinary spirit of the early 17th century, a spirit that sought to apply the rigor of the natural sciences to the messy realm of human affairs. The peace that Hobbes had known in his academic years was shattered in 1642, when the English Civil War erupted, pitting King Charles I against a parliament dominated by Puritan forces. The war was not merely a clash of arms, it was a clash of worldviews. Royalists clung to the divine right of kings, while parliamentarians championed a new contractarian vision of governance rooted in the consent of the governed. Hobbes, who had been appointed as a tutor to the future Charles II during a brief period of royal favor, found himself caught in the eye of the storm. He witnessed firsthand the breakdown of social order, the siege of towns, the looting of countryside, and the pervasive sense that the bonds that held society together were fraying. One anecdote from this period illustrates the depth of Hobbes's disillusionment. In the spring of 1645, after the royalist forces had suffered a crushing defeat at the Battle of Naseby, Hobbes traveled to the town of Salisbury, where he observed a scene that would later haunt his imagination. The streets were filled with refugees, farmers, merchants, even former soldiers, who had been stripped of their possessions and forced to barter for food with whatever they could carry. As he walked among them, Hobbes heard a mother lament, "If the king were but a man, why does he let us starve?" The desperate cries of the people, the palpable absence of any higher authority to protect them, crystallized for Hobbes a grim reality. Without a sovereign power to impose order, life descended into a state of nature that was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. This phrase, later immortalized in his seminal work Leviathan, was not a rhetorical flourish but a lived observation, a direct response to the carnage he had witnessed. The experience of the Civil War also propelled Hobbes into a public intellectual arena that was, at the time, fiercely contested. In 1651, he entered a pamphlet debate with the Levelers, a radical political movement that advocated for popular sovereignty, extended suffrage, and legal equality. The Levelers had published a manifesto titled An Agreement of the People, calling for a new social contract that would limit the power of the monarch and empower the citizenry. Hobbes responded with Decisive on the Citizen, a treatise that defended absolute sovereignty as the only safeguard against the chaos of anarchy. In the pamphlet, he argued, the only way to escape the war of all against all is to lay down the power to the sovereign, who may be a man, a council, or an assembly, but who must have the absolute authority to command. The debate was not merely academic. It was a battle for the soul of a nation in crisis. Hobbes's insistence on a strong, centralized authority was, in many ways, a direct reaction to the disorder he had seen, while the Leveller's vision echoed the nascent ideas of social contract that John Locke would later elaborate. The pamphlet exchange illustrates how Hobbes's political thought was forged in the crucible of civil conflict, a crucible that demanded clarity, certainty, and an unyielding answer to the question of how society could survive. Parallel to Hobbes's experience in England, across the Alps, another mind was forming its own response to the political and social conditions of its time. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was born in 1712 in Geneva, a city-state that prided itself on its republican institutions and its reputation as a bastion of Protestant independence. Yet Geneva was not the utopia it claimed to be. The city was governed by a small oligarchy of patrician families who controlled the council, the courts, and the militia. While the city's constitution granted a degree of political participation, the reality was that power remained concentrated in the hands of a few. Rousseau's father, Isaac Rousseau, was a master watchmaker, a craftsman whose trade required precision, patience, and an eye for the intricate workings of mechanisms, an early echo of the mechanistic themes that would later appear in Hobbes's work, though manifested in a very different cultural context. Rousseau's early childhood was marked by instability. His mother, Suzanne Bernard, died when he was only 2 years old, and his father, unable to care for him, placed the boy in the care of an aunt in the nearby town of Nyon. At the age of 10, Rousseau was sent back to Geneva to live with his father, who had remarried a woman of modest means. The young Rousseau attended the College de Genève, where he received a classical education steeped in the works of the ancients, Plato, Aristotle, and the Stoics, yet he found the curriculum restrictive, a series of rote lessons that left little room for imagination. It was here, in the quiet corridors of the college, that he first encountered the writings of the Enlightenment, especially the works of John Locke and Montesquieu, whose ideas about natural rights and the separation of powers sparked a curiosity that would later blossom into a lifelong quest for authenticity. Rousseau's first major encounter with the broader intellectual world came in 1728, when he left Geneva for the city of Paris, a metropolis that pulsed with the vibrant energy of salons, cafes, and the burgeoning republic of letters. He entered the world of the Enlightenment not as a fully formed philosopher, but as a modest copyist and tutor, taking odd jobs to make ends meet. Yet Paris offered Rousseau something he had never known in Geneva. A community of thinkers who gathered in the salons of Madame de Tencin, Madame Geoffrin, and later, the infamous gatherings at the Salon of the Abbé de Saint-Pierre. These salons were not merely social gatherings. They were crucibles of ideas where philosophers, scientists, and artists exchanged thoughts on morality, politics, and the nature of humanity. One anecdote that captures the precariousness of Rousseau's early Parisian existence involves the theft of his manuscript for Confessions. In 1764, after years of laboring in obscurity, Rousseau finally completed the first volume of his autobiographical work, a daring and intimate revelation of his own thoughts, feelings, and even his failings. He entrusted the manuscript to a close friend, a fellow writer named Jacques Donatien Le Rich de la Pouplinière, who was known for his patronage of the arts. However, before the manuscript could be published, it was stolen. Some accounts suggest it was taken by an angry rival. Others claim it was a simple act of opportunistic burglary. The loss of Confessions was a severe blow to Rousseau, not only because of the personal exposure it represented, but also because it delayed the dissemination of his ideas about self-knowledge and authenticity. The episode underscores the fragile nature of intellectual production in an age when the printed word could be both a weapon and a treasure. Rousseau's relationship with the Enlightenment salon culture took another dramatic turn in the form of his friendship-turned-rivalry with Denis Diderot, the chief editor of the Encyclopédie. The two met in the early 1740s, drawn together by a shared fascination with the critique of religious dogma and the exploration of human nature. Diderot, a prolific writer and a staunch advocate for the diffusion of knowledge, welcomed Rousseau into the circle of Encyclopédie contributors. Yet the collaboration was short-lived. Rousseau's Discourse on the Arts and Sciences, 1750, which argued that the progress of the arts had corrupted human morality, clashed with Diderot's belief in the emancipatory power of reason and scientific advancement. The tension escalated when Diderot, in a private letter, referred to Rousseau's arguments as a nostalgic longing for a mythic past, a criticism that cut deep into Rousseau's sensibilities. Their correspondence grew increasingly hostile, culminating in Diderot's refusal to publish Rousseau's later works in the Encyclopédie. This rupture illustrates how the Enlightenment was not a monolithic movement but a contested arena where differing visions of progress and human nature collided. The political turbulence that shaped Hobbes and Rousseau cannot be understood without comparing the contexts of 17th century England and 18th century Geneva. England's civil war was a violent struggle over the very legitimacy of monarchical power. The war's aftermath left a nation grappling with the balance between sovereign authority and parliamentary representation, a tension that would later be resolved, at least in part, by the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and the subsequent constitutional settlement. Hobbes's experience of this chaos led him to champion an absolute sovereign as the antidote to the war of all against all. His mechanistic view of human beings as bodies composed of parts, driven by appetites and aversions, mirrored the scientific revolution's attempt to reduce the world to predictable laws. Geneva, by contrast, was a city-state that had avoided the large-scale wars that ravaged its neighbors, yet its internal politics were no less fraught. The patrician oligarchy that ruled the city was resistant to the rising tide of popular sentiment that demanded greater participation and social equality. Rousseau's exile in 1762, precipitated by a scandal involving the alleged misappropriation of funds from the Geneva Council, was a direct result of the city's intolerance for dissenting voices. While Hobbes sought to impose order from above, Rousseau looked inward, seeking to uncover the natural goodness of man that he believed had been corrupted by civilization. This divergence is starkly reflected in their respective philosophical projects. Hobbes's Leviathan constructs a massive, artificial organism, an artificial sovereign, to keep the natural instincts of man in check, whereas Rousseau's Discourse on Inequality and the Social Contract attempt to reconstruct the political organism from the ground up, based on a hypothetical state of nature where humans are free, equal, and uncorrupted. To appreciate the depth of their intellectual inheritance, we must also consider the influence of other thinkers who loomed large in their formative years. John Locke, whose two treatises of government were published in 1689, offered a vision of government as a fiduciary entity, bound to protect life, liberty, and property. Locke's emphasis on natural rights and the right of rebellion against tyrannical rule presented a direct counterpoint to Hobbes's absolutism. Hobbes, aware of Locke's arguments, responded indirectly in Leviathan by asserting that the fear of violent death was the primary motivator for individuals to cede their rights to a sovereign. In this sense, Hobbes's work can be read as a preemptive rebuttal to Locke's more optimistic view of human rationality. Machiavelli, writing a century earlier, offered another lens through which both Hobbes and Rousseau would view political authority. The prince presented a pragmatic, sometimes ruthless, approach to power, an approach that resonated with Hobbes's perception of the sovereign as a necessary, perhaps even merciless, guardian of order. Yet Rousseau would later invoke Machiavelli's notion of virtue in a different manner, suggesting that true virtue lies not in the cunning manipulation of power, but in the authentic expression of the general will, a concept he would later formalize in the Social Contract. In both cases, Machiavelli's work served as a reference point, a reminder that political authority is always a negotiation between the ruler and the ruled, a theme that both Hobbes and Rousseau would explore from opposite ends of the spectrum. The scientific milieu also left an indelible mark on both thinkers. Hobbes's early exposure to the works of Galileo, Kepler, and later, the mathematical treatises of Isaac Newton, reinforced his belief that the natural world could be understood through laws of motion and cause and effect. He sought to apply this mechanistic framework to human behavior, famously stating that the passions of men are the same as the motions of bodies. In Deceive, he argued that just as the universe follows predictable patterns, so too does human nature, and therefore political structures can be designed with the same precision. This scientific optimism, though applied to the domain of politics, reflected the broader intellectual shift of the 17th century, where the boundaries between physics, metaphysics, and ethics began to blur. Rousseau, meanwhile, was deeply influenced by the burgeoning field of natural history and the romantic turn toward the sublime in nature. The writings of Jean-Baptiste Rousseau, no relation, the poet who celebrated the pastoral, and the later works of the naturalist Buffon, who described the gradual development of species, fed into Rousseau's belief that humans, in their natural state, were untainted by the corrupting influences of society. In his Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, Rousseau draws upon observations of indigenous peoples, noting that the savage lives in a state of perfect liberty. without the artificial constraints imposed by the laws of civilization. This perspective, while not scientifically rigorous by modern standards, illustrates how the emerging natural sciences informed his philosophical imagination, providing a backdrop against which he could critique the progress of civilization. The personal narratives of Hobbes and Rousseau also intersect with broader cultural currents of their times. Hobbes's involvement with the royalist court placed him at the heart of a network of patrons, scholars, and political actors. He served as a tutor to the future Charles II, a position that granted him access to the inner workings of monarchical power, yet also exposed him to the precariousness of royal favor. When the Commonwealth under Oliver Cromwell took power, Hobbes retreated into relative obscurity, focusing on his scientific studies and the composition of Leviathan, which he completed in 1651, but could not publish until 1658 after the Restoration. The delay in publication underscores the delicate balance Hobbes had to maintain between his intellectual convictions and the shifting political winds. Rousseau's personal journey was marked by a series of betrayals and reconciliations that shaped his worldview. After the theft of his Confessions manuscript, he faced a bitter dispute with the publisher Mark Mitchell Ray, who allegedly altered portions of the text without Rousseau's consent. This experience reinforced Rousseau's suspicion of institutional authority, leading him to retreat further into a life of solitude, famously living in the woods of Montmorency and later, in a modest cabin near the River Seine. His self-imposed exile was not merely a physical withdrawal but a philosophical stance, a deliberate choice to live in accordance with the principles he espoused, to experience the state of nature within the confines of a modern city. In his own words, "I have always believed that a man is not a citizen of any country, but a citizen of the world." This sentiment reflects a profound disillusionment with the nation-state, a theme that would later echo in the revolutionary fervor of the French Revolution. The interplay between their personal experiences and intellectual developments can be further illuminated by considering the role of primary texts. In Leviathan, Hobbes famously writes, "Covenants without the sword are but words, and of no strength to secure a man at all." This stark assertion reflects his belief that the mere promise of mutual agreement is insufficient without an external force to enforce it, a force embodied by the sovereign. The phrase is not abstract, it is a direct response to the chaos he observed during the English Civil War, where broken promises and shifting allegiances led to widespread bloodshed. In contrast, Rousseau's The Social Contract opens with the declaration, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." This paradox captures his conviction that while humans possess an innate liberty, the structures of society, laws, property, institutions, impose constraints that betray that original freedom. The juxtaposition of these two opening lines provides a powerful illustration of how each philosopher's historical context shaped the very foundations of their thought. Even the language they chose to convey their ideas bears witness to their respective milieus. Hobbes's prose is dense, methodical, and often reminiscent of the scholastic disputations of medieval universities. He employs a systematic approach, defining terms, constructing logical syllogisms, and building his arguments layer by layer. This style mirrors the scientific rigor of the age, where clarity and precision were prized above all. Rousseau, on the other hand, writes with a lyrical, emotive quality, weaving personal reflection into philosophical discourse. His Confessions reads almost like a novel, inviting readers into his intimate thoughts and feelings. This narrative technique reflects the Enlightenment's growing emphasis on individual subjectivity and the romantic turn toward the inner life of the self. The influence of the salons and the Republic of Letters cannot be overstated in Rousseau's development. In the salons of Paris, he encountered the ideas of Voltaire, whose wit and advocacy for religious tolerance provided a model of public intellectualism. Yet Rousseau's relationship with Voltaire was fraught. While they shared a common disdain for the dogmatic authority of the Church, they diverged sharply on the role of reason in human life. Voltaire's satirical Candide mocked the optimism of Leibniz, whereas Rousseau's Discourse on the Arts and Sciences argued that the progress of knowledge had led to moral decay. Their intellectual rivalry illustrates how the Enlightenment was a tapestry of competing visions, each thread pulling at the others, shaping a dynamic discourse that would ultimately produce the modern philosophical landscape. Cross-references to other thinkers further enrich our understanding of Hobbes and Rousseau's intellectual trajectories. Locke's second treatise argues for the right of individuals to revolt against tyrannical governments, a principle that would later inspire the American and French revolutions. Hobbes, aware of Locke's arguments, countered that rebellion would only plunge society back into the chaos of the state of nature, a position he defended by invoking the fear of violent death as the ultimate motivator for obedience. Meanwhile, Rousseau's concept of the general will can be seen as a synthesis of Locke's natural rights and Machiavelli's pragmatic politics, reimagined through a lens that emphasizes collective sovereignty over individual property rights. The tension between individual liberty and collective authority that both philosophers grappled with continues to reverberate in contemporary political theory. The political turbulence of England and the social rigidity of Geneva also shaped the ways in which Hobbes and Rousseau engaged with the concept of law. Hobbes's legal theory is built upon the premise that law is a command issued by the sovereign, backed by the threat of force. In Leviathan, he writes, "The law of nature is a precept or general rule found out by reason, by which a man is forbidden to do anything which is destructive of his life." Yet he also acknowledges that the sovereign's law supersedes natural law, a concession that underscores his belief in the necessity of absolute authority. Rousseau, conversely, envisions law as an expression of the general will, a collective agreement that reflects the true interests of the people. He famously declares, "Laws are only valid when they are made by the people and for the people." This democratic ideal stands in stark contrast to Hobbes's top-down approach, highlighting how their distinct experiences of political instability informed their divergent visions of legal legitimacy. The personal hardships they endured also left indelible marks on their ethical outlooks. Hobbes, having witnessed the death of his mother at a young age and the loss of his patronage during the Commonwealth, developed a worldview that emphasized self-preservation above all else. His famous assertion that the natural condition of mankind is a war of every man against every man can be read as a philosophical echo of his own struggle for survival in a world where alliances were fleeting and power could shift overnight. Rousseau, on the other hand, experienced the pain of social rejection when his ideas were censored in Geneva and his reputation was tarnished by accusations of moral depravity. This sense of alienation fueled his belief that society itself was the source of human misery, leading him to argue that the corruption of man began with the emergence of private property and the division of labor. The interplay of personal narrative and philosophical doctrine is perhaps most poignantly illustrated in their respective autobiographies. Hobbes's The History of the Reign of King Henry VII, written early in his career, presents a monarchist perspective that celebrates strong centralized power as a means of achieving stability. The work is not merely historical. It serves as a prelude to his later political treatises, a literary rehearsal of the ideas he would later codify in Leviathan. Rousseau's Confessions, by contrast, is a raw, unfiltered account of his inner life, a confession of his doubts, his passions, and his failures. In it, he writes, "I have always been a man who loves to be alone, yet I am also a man who craves the love of others." This paradox mirrors the tension in his political philosophy between the individual's natural freedom and the demands of the collective. To bring these biographical threads together, let us consider a brief timeline that situates the major events of their lives and intellectual development. Thomas Hobbes was born in 1588, entered Oxford in 1608, and formed his lifelong friendship with William Petty during his university years. The English Civil War erupted in 1642, and Hobbes observed its devastation firsthand. In 1651, he engaged in a pamphlet debate with the Levelers, publishing Deceive that same year. Leviathan was finally released in 1651, though its circulation was limited until after the Restoration in 1660, when Hobbes was appointed to the royal court of Charles II. He continued to write and revise his works until his death in 1679, leaving a legacy that would shape political philosophy for centuries to come. Jean-Jacques Rousseau entered the world in 1712, lost his mother in 1714, and was raised in Geneva's modest patrician environment. He moved to Paris in 1728, immersing himself in the salon culture. The theft of his Confessions manuscript occurred in 1764, a pivotal moment that delayed the publication of his autobiographical work. His friendship with Diderot began in the early 1740s, but the rivalry deepened after the publication of the Discourse on the Arts and Sciences in 1750. Rousseau's exile from Geneva in 1762 marked a turning point, leading him to a life of itinerant writing and public controversy. He published The Social Contract in 1762, and his later works, including Emile and the Reveries of the Solitary Walker, continued to influence the revolutionary fervor that would sweep Europe in the decades after his death in 1778. When we place these milestones side by side, a pattern emerges. Both thinkers lived through periods of profound upheaval, yet their responses to that upheaval diverged dramatically. Hobbes, scarred by the violence of civil war, turned inward to the certainty of mechanistic law, seeking to bind humanity with an unyielding sovereign. Rousseau, disillusioned by the constraints of a republican oligarchy, turned outward, seeking to rediscover a lost natural goodness that could be reclaimed through a renewed social contract. Their lives, their friendships, their rivalries, and the very languages they chose to articulate their visions all testify to the profound influence of personal context on philosophical invention. In reflecting upon these histories, we might ask ourselves, to what extent are our own political convictions shaped by the turbulence we witness in our daily lives? Does the experience of chaos drive us toward order, or does it awaken a yearning for authentic freedom? The stories of Hobbes and Rousseau invite us to consider how the storms of history can both shatter and forge the ideas that guide societies for generations. Their biographies are not merely footnotes to their theories. They are the very soil from which those theories grew, rich with the nutrients of personal struggle, intellectual curiosity, and the relentless quest to make sense of a world in flux. Thus, as we move forward to examine the core doctrines of Hobbes's absolutism and Rousseau's democratic naturalism, let us carry with us the vivid images of a young scholar wandering the cloisters of Oxford, a disillusioned tutor watching a kingdom dissolve into blood, a Geneva orphan tracing the contours of a city's patrician houses, and a wandering writer clutching a stolen manuscript in the dim light of a Parisian café. These images remind us that philosophy is never born in a vacuum. It is always the echo of lived experience, the reverberation of history, and the dialogue between the mind and the world it seeks to understand. When we speak of the foundations of human nature, we are really asking a question that has haunted philosophers for centuries. What are we at our most basic, before any laws, before any governments, before any culture can shape us? Two towering figures, Thomas Hobbes and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, approached this question from opposite poles, and their answers still echo in the corridors of modern political thought. In this segment, we will walk through their visions of the state of nature, examine the arguments they built upon, test those arguments against counter views, and see how their ideas ripple into today's debates about rights, authority, and what it means to be human. Let us begin with Thomas Hobbes, a man whose life was shaped by the turbulence of the English Civil War. The war, with its shifting allegiances and the sudden collapse of the militia that once protected towns, left a deep imprint on his mind. In his seminal work, Leviathan, Hobbes writes, "In such condition there is no place for industry, because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth, no navigation, nor use of the commodities that may be imported by sea. No building, no instrument of moving, no knowledge of the earth, no society." He paints a picture of humanity stripped of the comforts of civilization, left only with appetites and aversions, with desire for self-preservation and an equally powerful fear of death. For Hobbes, these two forces are the engines of all human action. Imagine a world where every individual is guided solely by the desire to obtain what they need and avoid what they dread. There is no law to temper those impulses, no moral compass handed down by tradition. In such a scenario, Hobbes argues, we would descend into what he famously described as a condition that is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. The phrase itself, though terse, carries a weight that has resonated through the ages. It is not merely a literary flourish, it is a diagnostic of human life when stripped of the protective scaffolding of authority. The solitary aspect points to the absence of community, the poor to the lack of material security, the nasty to the constant threat of violence, the brutish to the raw, unmediated competition for survival, and the short to the ever-present specter of premature death. To make this abstract picture more concrete, Hobbes offers a vivid thought experiment, a war of all against all, a bellum omnium contra omnes. Picture a plane where every person, driven by hunger, fear, and the desire to dominate, picks up whatever weapon they can find, sticks, stones, improvised spears, and turns against their neighbor. There is no police, no court, no agreed-upon rules. The only law that exists is the law of nature, which for Hobbes is simply the imperative to seek peace when possible, but also the readiness to fight when peace is threatened. In this imagined battlefield, alliances form and dissolve in an instant, trust is a luxury no one can afford, and the landscape becomes a tableau of perpetual conflict. The war of all against all is not a historical event, but a logical extrapolation of what Hobbes believes would happen when the mechanisms of order are removed. A historical anecdote that illustrates this descent into chaos is the collapse of the English militia during the early 1640s. As the parliamentarian forces and royalist factions vied for control, local militias, once the backbone of community defense, disintegrated under the weight of political infighting and lack of centralized command. Villages that had previously relied on these citizen soldiers found themselves vulnerable to banditry, looting, and the whims of marauding soldiers. In many towns, the absence of a unifying authority meant that neighbors turned on each other, seeking to protect their own scant resources. Hobbes would point to this as a real-world echo of his theoretical state of nature. Once the central power wanes, the social fabric frays, and the instinctual drive for self-preservation erupts into violent competition. From this bleak tableau, Hobbes draws his central political conclusion, that to escape the state of nature, humanity must collectively surrender a portion of its freedom to an absolute sovereign, what he calls the Leviathan. This sovereign, be it a monarch or an assembly, wields the power to enforce peace, to adjudicate disputes, and to protect the subjects from the war of all against all. In Hobbes' view, the authority of the Leviathan is not a tyrannical overreach, but a necessary antidote to the natural condition. He famously writes, "Covenants without the sword are but words." The sword, the coercive power of the sovereign, is what transforms a mere promise into a binding contract that can guarantee security. Now let us turn to the other side of the philosophical divide, to the Swiss thinker Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose reflections on human nature were shaped by a very different set of experiences. Rousseau lived in the Age of Enlightenment, yet he was also deeply attuned to the nascent romantic spirit that would soon blossom across Europe. He was fascinated by the idea of the noble savage, a term later popularized by others, but rooted in his own observations of societies untouched by European civilization. In Discourse on the Origin and Basis of Inequality Among Men and later in The Social Contract, Rousseau posits that in the state of nature, humans are not the brutish creatures Hobbes envisions, but rather beings guided by a natural compassion he calls pitié, a kind of innate empathy that restrains our selfish impulses. Rousseau's narrative begins with the myth of the Golden Age, a story that appears in many ancient cultures, describing a time when humanity lived in harmony with nature, free from want and conflict. He writes, "The first man was a beast of the forest. He was not yet a man, but he possessed a sense of compassion that prevented him from harming his fellow creatures." For Rousseau, the transition from this idyllic state to the corrupted societies we now inhabit is not caused by a lack of authority, but by the emergence of private property, the division of labor, and the consequent rise of comparison and envy. He famously declares, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains," a line that, while often quoted in discussions of political liberty, also hints at the deeper moral bondage that arises when natural compassion is supplanted by artificial inequality. To illustrate his point, Rousseau draws on his observations of indigenous peoples of the Americas, particularly the peoples he encountered through the travelogues of explorers and missionaries. He notes that many of these societies lived with a communal sense of ownership, shared resources, and a social structure that emphasized consensus over domination. In his words, they have no private property, and consequently no jealousy, no ambition, no envy, no hatred. While modern anthropologists would caution against idealizing these cultures, Rousseau uses them as a living counter-example to Hobbes's bleak natural condition. He argues that when humans are left to their own devices, without the corrupting influence of property and competition, they exhibit a natural inclination toward cooperation and mutual aid. Rousseau's concept of the general will emerges from this foundation of natural compassion. Unlike the will of all, which aggregates individual preferences, the general will reflects the collective interest of the community, guided by reason and a shared sense of the common good. It is not a simple majority rule, but a moral force that can, in theory, align personal liberty with collective responsibility. When individuals submit to the general will, they are not surrendering their freedom to a sovereign. Rather, they are participating in a form of self-government that emanates from the very nature of human sociability. Rousseau writes, "The general will is always rightful and tends to the public advantage." In this view, the state is not a necessary evil to escape chaos, but an expression of the natural social bonds that already exist in the state of nature. Having laid out the core visions of Hobbes and Rousseau, we must now turn to the counter-arguments that have shaped the subsequent discourse. The most prominent challenger to both thinkers is John Locke, whose second treatise of government offers a markedly different picture of the state of nature. Locke envisions a condition where individuals are equal and independent, bound by a law of nature that obliges them not to harm each other's life, liberty, or property. He writes, "The state of nature has a law of nature to govern it which obliges everyone, and reason, which is that law, teaches all mankind that no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions." Unlike Hobbes, Locke does not see the state of nature as a war of all against all. Rather, he sees it as a generally peaceful environment where natural rights already exist. The role of government, then, is not to impose order upon chaos, but to protect those pre-existing rights more effectively. In this sense, Locke's natural rights theory undercuts Hobbes's justification for an absolute sovereign, while also challenging Rousseau's claim that the state of nature is a realm of innate compassion that must be preserved through a collective general will. Another line of critique comes from those who argue that Hobbes's pessimism exaggerates the darkness of human nature. Enlightenment thinkers such as David Hume and later the utilitarian philosophers like Jeremy Bentham contended that humans possess both selfish and benevolent tendencies, and that social institutions can cultivate the latter. Hume, for instance, observed that the passions of mankind are not so ungovernable as Hobbes would have us think, suggesting that reason, sympathy, and habit can temper raw appetites. More contemporary scholars in evolutionary psychology, such as Steven Pinker, point to the better angels of our nature that have emerged through cooperative mechanisms, reciprocal altruism, and the development of social norms. They argue that while aggression is a part of our evolutionary heritage, so too is the capacity for empathy, fairness, and group cohesion, traits that Hobbes's mechanistic model downplays. In this light, Hobbes's call for an all-powerful sovereign may be seen as an overcorrection, a philosophical response to a problem that, in practice, is mitigated by the very social instincts he claims are suppressed. Rousseau, too, faces significant criticism. Critics argue that his idealization of the noble savage neglects the evidence of intra-group conflict, warfare, and resource competition among pre-state societies. Anthropologists such as Jared Diamond have documented that even hunter-gatherer groups engaged in raids, feuds, and territorial disputes. Moreover, Rousseau's notion of the general will has been invoked, perhaps misused, to justify authoritarian regimes that claim to represent the collective interest while suppressing dissent. The French Revolution's Jacobin phase, for instance, invoked the general will to legitimize the reign of terror, a stark reminder that the abstraction of a unified will can mask the suppression of pluralism. These counterexamples force us to ask, can the general will ever truly reflect the diverse, often conflicting, interests of a modern population, or does it risk becoming a veneer for majoritarian tyranny? To deepen our understanding, let us draw an analogy that bridges both philosophers' ideas with a familiar modern institution, the Internet. Imagine the Internet as a vast, borderless space where individuals can express appetites and aversions without immediate oversight. In a Hobbesian reading, the Internet without regulation would devolve into a war of all against all, filled with trolling, misinformation, and cyberbullying, a digital echo of the brutish state of nature. Consequently, we erect platforms, terms of service, and even governmental legislation to impose order, a digital Leviathan. Conversely, a Rousseauian perspective would highlight the Internet's capacity to foster natural compassion and collective problem-solving. Open-source communities, crowdsourced science projects, and global humanitarian campaigns illustrate how the general will can emerge from a shared sense of purpose, even in the absence of a central authority. Yet the same digital realm also reveals the limits of both theories. While regulation can curb the worst excesses, it can also stifle the spontaneous generosity that Rousseau celebrates, and the organic cooperation that arises can be fragile in the face of coordinated manipulation. Turning now to real-world applications, consider the design of constitutional frameworks. The United States Constitution, for example, reflects a Hobbesian wariness of unchecked power through its system of checks and balances, separation of powers, and the establishment of a sovereign state capable of enforcing law. Yet it also incorporates Rousseauian elements by emphasizing popular sovereignty, the idea that legitimate authority derives from the consent of the governed, a notion resonant with the general will. The French Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, heavily influenced by Rousseau, enshrines natural rights and the principle that the aim of any political association is the preservation of the natural and imprescriptible rights of man. Here, we see a synthesis. A state that protects rights not by imposing absolute authority, but by recognizing an inherent dignity that predates the state itself. Modern evolutionary psychology offers another lens through which to evaluate Hobbes and Rousseau. Researchers have identified dual inheritance theory, which posits that human behavior is shaped by both genetic predispositions and cultural evolution. From this perspective, Hobbes's emphasis on self-preservation aligns with the evolutionary drive for survival, while Rousseau's focus on empathy corresponds to the development of reciprocal altruism, behaviors that increase group fitness. The tension between competition and cooperation is not resolved in favor of one side, Rather, it is a dynamic interplay that varies across contexts. This nuanced view supports a middle path. Societies require institutions that can harness both our competitive instincts and our cooperative capacities, a point that both Hobbes and Rousseau, despite their stark differences, implicitly acknowledge. The Romantic movement of the late 18th and early 19th centuries provides a cultural backdrop that amplified Rousseau's ideas. Poets such as William Wordsworth and painters like Caspar David Friedrich celebrated the purity of nature and the emotional depth of the individual, echoing Rousseau's belief that civilization corrupts an originally virtuous soul. In contrast, the Romantic fascination with the sublime, nature's awe-inspiring, sometimes terrifying power, mirrors Hobbes's recognition that without order, the natural world can be a source of existential dread. The Romantic era, therefore, can be seen as a cultural synthesis of both philosophers, a yearning for the unspoiled goodness of the natural state, coupled with an awareness of humanity's vulnerability in the face of an indifferent universe. Let us revisit the historical anecdotes that illustrate these ideas in action. The English militia's collapse, mentioned earlier, was not merely a footnote in Hobbes's biography. It was a lived experience that convinced him of the necessity of a sovereign power capable of commanding resources and enforcing peace. Conversely, the example of the Iroquois Confederacy, which Rousseau admired, demonstrates a form of governance based on consensus and shared values rather than coercive authority. The Confederacy's great law of peace articulated principles of collective decision-making, mutual aid, and the protection of individual rights within a communal framework. While not a perfect embodiment of Rousseau's general will, it provides a historical case where a community managed to balance individual autonomy with collective responsibility without resorting to an absolute sovereign. In contemporary politics, we can observe Hobbesian and Rousseauian impulses in debates over surveillance versus privacy, security versus liberty. After terrorist attacks, governments often invoke the Hobbesian need for a strong, centralized authority to protect citizens, expanding surveillance powers and curtailing certain freedoms. Critics, invoking Rousseau's emphasis on natural compassion and the general will, argue that such measures erode the trust and empathy that bind societies together, and that true security arises from transparent, participatory governance. The tension between these positions reflects an ongoing negotiation of the balance Hobbes and Rousseau each sought to define. Cross-referencing further, Kant's moral philosophy introduces a third perspective that both engages and transcends Hobbes and Rousseau. Kant's categorical imperative, acting only according to maxims that one can will to become universal law, resembles Rousseau's general will in its appeal to a rational, collective principle, yet it also acknowledges the need for a legal framework to enforce moral duties, a nod to Hobbes's insistence on authority. Moreover, Marx's critique of civil society as a stage of alienation can be read as an extension of Rousseau's claim that society corrupts innate goodness, while also echoing Hobbes's concern that without a powerful state, class conflict could erupt into chaos. These interconnections demonstrate that the debate over human nature is not confined to a binary, but forms a lattice of ideas influencing each other across centuries. What, then, can we draw from this rich tapestry of thought? First, the state of nature is not a single, static concept, but a philosophical laboratory where we test the limits of human behavior. Hobbes's mechanistic model reminds us that without some form of collective security, the pursuit of self-interest can spiral into violence, a warning that resonates in any society facing fragmentation or anomie. Rousseau's vision, meanwhile, challenges us to recognize the latent capacities for empathy and cooperation that can be nurtured rather than suppressed. Both perspectives caution against extremes. An overbearing Leviathan can suffocate liberty, while an unbridled faith in innate goodness can ignore the real potential for conflict. Second, the notion of natural rights occupies a central place in this discourse. Locke's articulation of life, liberty, and property as pre-political rights offers a bridge between Hobbes's security-focused sovereign and Rousseau's moral community. By asserting that rights exist prior to the state, Locke provides a foundation for limiting sovereign power, a principle that undergirds modern liberal democracies. Yet the ongoing tension between collective security and individual rights remains unresolved, manifesting in contemporary debates over public health mandates, gun control, and digital privacy. Third, modern evolutionary psychology and the study of human cooperation suggest that the dichotomy between competition and compassion is false. Humans are equipped with both aggressive and altruistic instincts, and the expression of either depends heavily on environmental conditions, cultural norms, and institutional structures. This insight invites a synthesis, Perhaps the best political arrangements are those that channel competitive drives into productive channels, such as market competition regulated to prevent exploitation, while fostering cooperative instincts through education, civic engagement, and shared narratives that appeal to the general will. Finally, the historical anecdotes and analogies we have explored serve as reminders that philosophy is not an abstract exercise detached from lived experience. The collapse of the English militia, the communal governance of the Iroquois, the mythic Golden Age, the modern Internet, each provides a concrete illustration of how the ideas of Hobbes and Rousseau play out in reality. By examining these examples, we can better appreciate the stakes involved when we choose to prioritize security over liberty or compassion over order. As we close this exploration of the foundations of human nature, let us pause and reflect on the words of Hobbes. The condition of man is a condition of war of everyone against everyone, and on the words of Rousseau, man is born free and everywhere he is in chains. Both statements capture a paradox that continues to shape our political imagination. They ask us to consider whether we are, at our core, solitary beings seeking safety through domination, or inherently social creatures whose freedom is realized through mutual respect and shared purpose. The answer, perhaps, lies not in choosing one philosopher over the other, but in recognizing that the human story is a continuous negotiation between these poles, a dance between the need for security and the yearning for authentic community. In the end, the state of nature is less a fixed point in history than a mirror we hold up to ourselves, asking what we value most when the trappings of civilization are stripped away. It invites us to ask, with a calm and reflective mind, whether the societies we build today honor the compassionate instincts Rousseau celebrated, the security concerns Hobbes warned us about, and the natural rights that Locke proclaimed. And as we grapple with these questions, we continue the long philosophical conversation that began centuries ago, a conversation that remains as vital now as ever. When we speak of the social contract, we are really tracing a line that stretches from the darkened streets of 17th century London to the bustling squares of modern democracies, a line that is drawn in the ink of philosophy and the blood of history alike. Imagine for a moment a world without any governing authority, a world in which each person is left to pursue his own desire, his own safety, his own survival. In that imagined state, what would compel a farmer to share his grain with a neighbor, or a merchant to trust that his credit will be honored? Thomas Hobbes, in his monumental work Leviathan, answers this question by turning the chaos of nature into a calculus of fear and self-preservation. He writes, "The natural condition of mankind is a war of all against all," a phrase that still reverberates whenever we hear the word anarchy. From that bleak portrait emerges his contract. Individuals, driven by the right of nature, surrender all their natural rights to a single, absolute sovereign, in exchange for peace, order, and the preservation of life itself. The right of nature, for Hobbes, is the liberty each person possesses to use any means necessary to preserve his own existence. It is a power, not a moral claim, and it extends to the very act of killing another if that act is required for self-defense. Yet this right is not without limits. Hobbes introduces the law of nature, a pre-political rule that commands men to seek peace and to follow it whenever possible. The first law of nature, he says, is that every man ought to endeavor peace as far as he has hope of obtaining it. The second law tells us that, once peace is secured, the parties must be willing to lay down their right of nature, to bind themselves to a covenant that makes the sovereign the final arbiter of justice. In this sense, the sovereign is not a tyrant imposed from above, but the very instrument that makes peace possible, a Leviathan that, like a great ship, keeps the storm-tossed vessels of humanity from being dashed upon the rocks of mutual destruction. Consider the formation of a city-state in ancient Mesopotamia. The early inhabitants of the Fertile Crescent faced frequent raids, unpredictable floods, and fierce competition over irrigation water. To survive, they gathered under a single ruler, often a king who claimed divine mandate and agreed to obey his edicts in return for protection of their fields and families. This is a concrete illustration of Hobbes's abstract contract. The people relinquished the right to take the law into their own hands, and the sovereign, in turn, provided the security that allowed agriculture, trade, and culture to flourish. The city-state of Uruk, for example, grew into a powerful polity because its citizens trusted that the king would enforce the law against bandits and rival city-states. The very existence of a stable market, of recorded law codes such as the Code of Ur-Nammu, depended on the acceptance that the sovereign's authority was the guarantor of peace. Fast forward to the present, and we see a softened version of Hobbes's sovereign in the constitutional monarchies of Europe. Take the United Kingdom. The crown no longer commands the sword in an absolute sense. yet the monarch remains the symbolic embodiment of the state's unity and continuity. The real power now resides in Parliament, a body that, through a complex system of checks and balances, enacts the laws that preserve peace and order. The citizens, in turn, consent through elections, through the rule of law, through the very act of paying taxes, to a shared sovereignty that is both limited and absolute in its capacity to guarantee security. The British model reflects Hobbes's insight that without a central authority, the war of all against all would erupt, but it also demonstrates how that authority can be constrained by constitutional mechanisms, thereby addressing one of the most persistent criticisms of Hobbes's theory. Critics of Hobbes argue that his sovereign, by virtue of being absolute, inevitably slides into tyranny. The French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, for instance, contends that surrendering all rights to a single ruler is a betrayal of the very freedom that makes human beings distinct from beasts. He writes in the Discourse on the origin of inequality, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." Rousseau's critique is not merely rhetorical, it is grounded in a different conception of the natural state. For him, the natural condition of man is not a perpetual war, but a condition of solitary, uncomplicated existence, where each individual enjoys a kind of natural liberty that is later corrupted by the advent of private property. In Rousseau's view, the social contract must preserve that original liberty, not extinguish it under the weight of a sovereign's will. Rousseau's social contract, articulated most famously in the Social Contract, proposes a collective agreement to form the general will, a will that is not the sum of individual desires, but the expression of the common good as discerned by the community as a whole. The general will, he declares, always tends to the preservation of the person and the property of the whole community. The key is participation. Each citizen must be an active legislator, not merely a subject. By entering the contract, individuals do not lose their freedom. Rather, they exchange the liberty of making isolated choices for the liberty of obeying laws that they have, in effect, prescribed for themselves through the general will. In this way, freedom is reimagined as collective self-determination. The Swiss cantons provide a vivid historical illustration of Rousseau's contract in practice. In the late medieval period, the cantons of Switzerland, small, self-governing territories nestled among the Alps, formed a confederation based on mutual defense and shared decision-making. Each canton retained its local autonomy, yet they convened in the Tagsitzung, an assembly where delegates deliberated on matters that affected the whole confederation. The Swiss model embodied the principle that the general will could arise from a federation of distinct communities, each contributing its voice to a larger, consensual authority. The system persisted for centuries, surviving the pressures of larger neighboring powers, precisely because the cantons saw themselves as participants in a collective contract rather than subjects of a distant monarch. A more dramatic, though more turbulent, example is the early French Revolution, particularly the period of the National Constituent Assembly in 1789. In the wake of the Estates General, representatives from the three estates gathered, not to reinforce the old regime, but to draft a constitution that would embody the general will of the nation. The famous declaration Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité was not a slogan alone. It was an attempt to articulate a collective commitment to liberty and equality through participatory lawmaking. The Assembly's debates over the abolition of feudal privileges, the declaration of the rights of man and of the citizen, and the drafting of a constitution were all attempts to realize Rousseau's vision. A political order where citizens, as co-legislators, shape the laws that bind them. Though the revolution would later descend into the terror of the Jacobins, the initial moment stands as a powerful testament to the possibility of a general will emerging from a diverse populace. Yet, as with Hobbes's absolute sovereign, Rousseau's general will is not immune to criticism. Detractors argue that the concept can be weaponized to justify majoritarian oppression. If the general will is equated with the will of the majority, then minority rights can be trampled under the guise of collective decision. The 19th century German philosopher Karl Popper warned that the tyranny of the majority can be as insidious as any external despot. In practice, the French Revolution's reign of terror demonstrated how a purportedly popular will could be twisted into a justification for sweeping purges, executions, and the suspension of civil liberties. Critics of Rousseau contend that without robust institutional safeguards, independent judiciaries, constitutional guarantees, protected minority rights, the general will can become a veneer for mob rule. Both Hobbes and Rousseau, despite their stark differences, intersect with contemporary democratic theory in ways that continue to shape political discourse. Modern scholars of deliberative democracy, such as Eugen Habermas, echo Rousseau's emphasis on participation, arguing that legitimacy arises from rational discourse among free and equal participants. At the same time, the realist school, represented by thinkers like Hans Morgenthau, resonates with Hobbes's caution that power and security are the foundations upon which any political order must be built. The balance between these insights is evident in today's constitutional democracies, where a strong central authority is tasked with maintaining order, yet is constrained by democratic institutions that ensure citizen participation and accountability. Marx's critique of the state offers yet another cross-reference that deepens our understanding of both contracts. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels describe the state as the executive committee of the bourgeoisie, a tool that preserves the interests of the ruling class. From a Marxist perspective, Hobbes's sovereign, even when limited by a constitution, remains an instrument of class domination, preserving the status quo of property relations that Hobbes himself never questioned. Conversely, Rousseau's general will, while ostensibly democratic, can be co-opted by dominant economic interests, turning the collective decision-making process into a facade that masks the perpetuation of inequality. Marx's analysis forces us to ask, whose interests are truly served when we speak of peace, security, or the common good? Are these concepts neutral, or are they embedded within material relations that favor certain groups over others? Let us return for a moment to the notion of the right of nature. Hobbes describes it as a power that each man has to preserve his own life. In modern terms, we might think of this right as the basic human instinct for self-preservation, akin to a biological imperative. Yet Hobbes also insists that this right is universal and invariable, a claim that raises profound ethical questions. If every individual possesses an absolute right to do whatever is necessary for self-preservation, does that not justify acts of aggression in the name of security? The law of nature, then, serves as a restraining principle, urging individuals to seek peace rather than conflict. This tension mirrors contemporary debates over the right to self-defense versus the collective right to security, a debate that surfaces in discussions about gun control, counter-terrorism measures, and the balance between civil liberties and state surveillance. Rousseau's counterpoint, the preservation of freedom through participation, can be seen in the modern practice of participatory budgeting. In cities like Porto Alegre, Brazil, citizens gather in assemblies to decide how a portion of the municipal budget will be allocated. This process reflects the idea that the general will is not a distant abstraction, but a concrete decision-making procedure where ordinary people have a direct hand in shaping public policy. By involving citizens in the allocation of resources, the community enacts a living version of Rousseau's contract. Each participant retains his freedom while contributing to the collective good. Such practices demonstrate that the general will can be operationalized in ways that protect against the tyranny of a single ruler, while also guarding against the tyranny of the majority through transparent deliberation and inclusive engagement. Historical anecdotes further illuminate the lived experience of these contracts. One anecdote concerns the English Civil War of the 1640s, a conflict that pitted royalists who defended the divine right of kings against parliamentarians who demanded that the sovereign's power be limited by law. The eventual execution of King Charles I in 1649 was a dramatic, albeit violent, assertion that even a monarch could be held accountable to a contract with his subjects. The subsequent establishment of the Commonwealth under Oliver Cromwell, though itself a form of absolute rule, was justified by the claim that the people had rescinded the previous contract and were establishing a new one based on the preservation of liberty and order. This episode illustrates the fluidity of social contracts. They can be broken, renegotiated, and reimagined in response to perceived breaches. Another anecdote, drawn from the Swiss experience, recounts the Sonderbund War of 1847. The Catholic cantons formed a separate alliance, the Sonderbund, to protect their religious and cultural autonomy against the increasingly centralized federal government. The federal forces, representing the broader general will of the Confederation, defeated the Sonderbund, leading to the creation of the modern Swiss Federal Constitution of 1848. This conflict underscores how the general will, when exercised through democratic institutions, can resolve deep-seated divisions, but also how the tension between local autonomy and collective authority must be carefully managed to avoid civil strife. In both Hobbes's and Rousseau's visions, the social contract is fundamentally an answer to the problem of human coexistence. Hobbes asks, how can we escape the state of nature, and answers with a sovereign who guarantees security. Rousseau asks, how can we retain freedom while living together, and answers with a collective will that is expressed through participation. The answers are not mutually exclusive. They can be seen as complementary strands of a single thread. A state that provides security without avenues for participation risks devolving into despotism, while a state that invites participation but cannot guarantee basic security may descend into chaos. Contemporary democratic theory often seeks to synthesize these strands. The concept of the welfare state, for example, can be read as a Hobbesian provision of security through social safety nets, public health, and law enforcement, combined with Rousseauian mechanisms of participation, such as elected legislatures and civil society organizations that shape policy. The Nordic countries, with their strong social safety nets and high levels of citizen engagement, exemplify this synthesis. Citizens trust that the state will protect them from economic insecurity, while also exercising their democratic rights to influence the direction of public spending, education, and environmental policy. In this way, the social contract becomes a living, evolving agreement rather than a static document. Marx's perspective adds a further layer of critique, reminding us that the state's provision of security and the articulation of the general will can both serve the interests of the ruling class. Marx argued that the bourgeois state, even when it appears democratic, functions to reproduce the conditions of capital accumulation. From this standpoint, the social contract is a false consciousness that masks the exploitation inherent in capitalist relations. Yet Marx also envisioned a future where the state would wither away, replaced by a classless society in which the need for a sovereign or a general will would be transcended by communal self-management. This radical vision pushes the discussion beyond the confines of Hobbes and Rousseau, urging us to imagine contracts that are not merely between individuals and a sovereign, but among equals in a cooperative commonwealth. To bring these ideas into the realm of everyday experience, consider the modern phenomenon of online communities. Platforms such as Wikipedia operate on a tacit social contract. Contributors agree to abide by shared guidelines, neutral point of view, verifiability, civility, in exchange for the collective benefit of a free encyclopedia. The sovereign here is not a monarch, but a set of community-enforced norms and a governance structure that can suspend or block users who violate the agreement. At the same time, the general will is expressed through consensus building on talk pages, where editors deliberate and reach collective decisions about content. This digital microcosm reflects both Hobbesian and Rousseauian elements, a mechanism for maintaining order and a process for participatory decision-making. In the realm of international relations, the United Nations can be viewed through the lens of Hobbes's contract. Nations surrender a portion of their sovereign authority to an international body that promises to maintain peace and security. The UN Charter, with its articles on collective security, mirrors Hobbes's law of nature that calls for the pursuit of peace whenever possible. Yet the UN also incorporates Rousseauian ideals through its General Assembly, where every member state has a voice, and through its emphasis on human rights, which seeks to protect individual freedoms within the global community. The tension between the Security Council's veto power, an embodiment of Hobbesian authority, and the broader, more egalitarian aspirations of the General Assembly exemplifies the ongoing negotiation between security and participation on the world stage. Returning to the question of whether Hobbes's sovereign is inherently tyrannical, we must examine the conditions under which the contract is formed. Hobbes argues that the sovereign's authority is justified only insofar as it can deliver peace. If the sovereign fails to protect its subjects, the contract is void. This conditionality offers a theoretical safeguard against tyranny, though in practice it is difficult to enforce. The modern constitutional monarchy, as we have noted, embeds this safeguard through legal constraints, parliamentary oversight, and a written constitution. The United Kingdom's unwritten constitution, with its conventions and statutes, creates a system where the monarch's powers are largely ceremonial, while the elected government bears the responsibility for security and welfare. The presence of an independent judiciary further ensures that the sovereign's actions can be reviewed and, if necessary, curtailed. Conversely, Rousseau's critics raise the specter of the tyranny of the majority. The concept of the general will presupposes that the community can discern the common good, but history shows that majorities can be swayed by demagoguery, prejudice, or short-term interests. The early French Revolution, again, provides a cautionary tale. The National Convention's adoption of the law of suspects allowed the revolutionary government to imprison and execute thousands under the pretext of protecting the general will. The lesson here is that participation alone does not guarantee liberty. Robust institutions, a culture of pluralism, and protections for dissent are essential to prevent the majority from imposing its will unchecked. Contemporary democratic theory offers solutions to these dilemmas. The concept of constitutional liberalism, championed by scholars such as John Rawls, suggests that a just society requires both a well-ordered political structure that secures basic liberties and a fair distribution of social and economic goods. Rawls's original position, thought experiment, with its veil of ignorance, can be seen as a modern reinterpretation of the social contract. Rational individuals, unaware of their own place in society, would choose principles that protect both security and freedom. In this sense, Rawls bridges Hobbes's concern for peace with Rousseau's insistence on participatory freedom, while also incorporating a concern for equality that Marx would later emphasize. The interplay of these ideas becomes even more vivid when we examine the modern constitutional monarchy of Japan. After World War II, the Japanese emperor renounced his divine status and became a symbolic figurehead, while the post-war constitution vested sovereign power in the elected diet. The Japanese example illustrates how a traditional sovereign can be transformed into a ceremonial role, preserving cultural continuity while ensuring that the real authority lies in democratic institutions that protect both peace and participation. The Japanese experience also highlights the importance of historical context. The trauma of war and the desire for lasting peace motivated the Japanese people to accept a new contract that prioritized security through a pacifist constitution, yet also allowed for democratic engagement. In sum, the social contract, whether articulated by Hobbes or Rousseau, is not a static relic of early modern philosophy, but a living framework that continues to shape our understanding of political legitimacy, authority, and freedom. Hobbes's emphasis on the right of nature and the law of nature offers a stark reminder that without a central authority capable of enforcing peace, societies risk descending into a perpetual state of conflict. Rousseau's vision of the general will remind us that legitimacy is not granted solely by the capacity to enforce order, but by the active participation of citizens in the creation of the laws that govern them. Both perspectives have been refined, challenged, and reimagined by later thinkers, Habermas, Rawls, Marx, Popper, and by the concrete experiences of city-states, constitutional monarchies, Swiss cantons, revolutionary assemblies, and even digital platforms. The challenge for any contemporary polity is to weave together the strengths of these contracts while mitigating their weaknesses. How can we design institutions that guarantee security without surrendering too much liberty? How can we ensure that the general will reflect true deliberation rather than the whims of a transient majority? The answer, perhaps, lies in a layered approach. A sovereign, whether embodied in a constitution, a parliament, or an international body, provides the necessary scaffolding for peace, while a vibrant civil society, robust legal protections, and mechanisms for direct citizen involvement ensure that the collective will remain responsive, inclusive, and just. In this delicate balance, the legacies of Hobbes and Rousseau continue to converse, reminding us that the quest for a just and peaceful society is, at its core, an ongoing social contract, one that we must constantly renegotiate, reflect upon, and renew. When we turn our attention to the great contest between Thomas Hobbes and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, we are really confronting two radically different visions of what it means to be free, what the state ought to be, and how authority can be justified without destroying the very thing it seeks to protect. Imagine, for a moment, a bustling market square in 17th century London, the streets still echoing the turmoil of civil war, the clatter of swords replaced by the clink of coins as merchants negotiate under the watchful eye of a new sovereign. Across the channel, in a quiet valley of Geneva, a young Rousseau is listening to the murmurs of the crowd, feeling the pulse of a community that seems to speak with one voice. These two scenes, though separated by geography and temperament, set the stage for a dialogue that still reverberates through our modern debates about surveillance cameras on street corners, about referenda that decide the fate of entire nations, about the delicate balance between security and liberty. Hobbes begins his argument in Leviathan with a stark picture of human life in the state of nature, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. He does not romanticize the pre-political condition. Instead, he portrays it as a perpetual war of every man against every man, where fear is the constant companion. In such a world, liberty, for Hobbes, is simply the absence of external impediments to motion. A man is free when nothing stops him from moving as he wishes, provided he can do so without being violently stopped by another. Yet, this very definition of liberty, when taken to its logical extreme, leads to chaos. If every individual pursues his own motion unchecked, the result is a relentless clash that threatens the very possibility of any lasting peace. To escape this nightmare, Hobbes proposes the establishment of an absolute sovereign, a monarch, an assembly, or any collective power that can command obedience through the covenant of the social contract. The sovereign's authority is not derived from any moral virtue or divine right. It is the product of a rational calculation that each person makes in order to preserve his own life. The contract is a transfer of the right to use force from the multitude to a single entity, thereby converting the perpetual war into a civil peace. In Hobbes' own words, the safety of the people is the supreme end of the covenant, and the sovereign is the final judge of all disputes. The sovereign, once invested with this power, may be despotic, may impose taxes, may command armies, may even punish without the consent of the governed, because the alternative, a return to the state of nature, would be far worse. Consider the English Restoration of 1660, a historical moment that offers a vivid illustration of Hobbesian logic in practice. After the execution of Charles I, the Commonwealth under Cromwell, and the ensuing instability, the monarchy was restored under Charles II. The Restoration was not merely a nostalgic return to a bygone era. It was a calculated move by a war-torn society to re-centralize authority in order to secure order. The new regime, while outwardly constitutional, increasingly relied on mechanisms that would later be recognized as the foundations of the modern police state. The establishment of a standing army, the use of secret informants, and the codification of laws that could be enforced uniformly across the realm all echo Hobbes's insistence that a powerful sovereign is the necessary antidote to anarchy. In this context, the tolerance of despotism, however harsh, becomes a pragmatic compromise. Citizens surrender a portion of their liberty in exchange for the promise of security and the cessation of civil war. Hobbes's definition of liberty as the mere absence of external obstruction also leads him to a peculiar tolerance of what we might today call authoritarian measures. Since liberty for him is not the ability to self-determine one's ends, but simply the freedom to act without being physically restrained, the sovereign's imposition of laws does not, in Hobbes's view, diminish liberty so long as those laws do not prevent the pursuit of one's own desires. If a law forbids the theft of a neighbor's horse, it does not stop a man from walking, from speaking, from thinking. It merely removes an external impediment to the peace of the community. Thus, the sovereign's power to enforce order is compatible with liberty, because liberty is defined narrowly. The paradox is clear. The more the sovereign secures the external environment, the more free the individual becomes, according to Hobbesian metrics. Rousseau, by contrast, opens his discourse in the social contract with a different premise, that humans are naturally good, but are corrupted by the institutions that bind them. He famously declares, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." For Rousseau, liberty is not the mere absence of external constraints. It is a positive, active condition, what he calls positive liberty. It is the capacity to act in accordance with a law that one has prescribed for oneself. This is not a vague ideal, it is a concrete political principle. The sovereign in Rousseau's construction is not a monarch imposing his will, but the collective will of the people, the general will, which expresses the common good. To obey the general will is, paradoxically, to be truly free, because one is obeying a law that one has, through participation, helped to shape. The ancient democracy of Athens offers a historical illustration that Rousseau admired, even if he recognized its limitations. In the Athenian polis, citizens gathered in the assembly to debate and vote directly on legislation, war, and public policy. There were no intermediaries to filter the will of the people. The law was the product of collective deliberation. Rousseau saw in this model a glimpse of the kind of self-legislation he prized. Yet he was also aware that such a system could only function in a small, relatively homogeneous community where every citizen could be expected to attend the assembly and speak with authority. He therefore turned to a more contemporary example that could scale, the Swiss system of referenda. In modern Switzerland, citizens regularly vote on national initiatives, can propose constitutional amendments, and can recall officials. This practice of direct democracy embodies Rousseau's vision of popular sovereignty. The people are not merely subjects of law, they are its authors. When a Swiss voter says yes to an initiative, she is exercising positive liberty, she is obeying a law that she has helped to create. Rousseau's insistence on positive liberty, however, raises a crucial question. Can a society truly preserve individual autonomy while demanding that individuals subordinate their personal desires to the general will? To answer this, Rousseau offers an analogy of the musician in an orchestra. Each musician has a personal instrument, a unique talent, and the freedom to play notes. Yet the music that emerges from the orchestra is not the sum of isolated solos. It is the harmonious product of each musician listening to the conductor and aligning his part with the others. The conductor, in this metaphor, represents the general will. the musician's freedom is not curtailed by following the conductor. Rather, his freedom is realized through the collective harmony. In the same way, the citizen's liberty is actualized when he participates in the formation of the general will and obeys it, because the law then reflects his own rational interests, not the arbitrary whims of a distant sovereign. The tension between Hobbes's negative liberty and Rousseau's positive liberty becomes especially vivid when we examine contemporary debates about surveillance. Imagine a city where cameras monitor every street corner, where algorithms track our movements, where data is collected in real time to predict crime. Proponents of such a surveillance state often invoke a Hobbesian rationale. By surrendering a slice of privacy, an external impediment, we gain safety, order, and the prevention of violent disorder. The logic is that the sovereign or the state must have the power to intervene preemptively to maintain peace. Critics, drawing on libertarian strands of Hobbesian thought, argue that this surrender erodes the very liberty Hobbes prized, because the absence of external impediments is no longer a neutral condition when the impediments are invisible, algorithmic, and potentially arbitrary. They claim that Hobbes's tolerance for despotism becomes a slippery slope, leading to a surveillance apparatus that can punish without due process, thereby violating the covenant that originally justified the sovereign's power. On the other side, Rousseauian critics point to the practical challenges of scaling direct democracy. In a nation of hundreds of millions, can every citizen meaningfully engage in the formulation of the general will? The answer, many argue, is no. The Swiss referenda system, while impressive, still relies on a sophisticated bureaucracy to draft initiatives, to verify signatures, and to educate the electorate. Moreover, the sheer volume of issues, budgetary, foreign policy, environmental regulation, can overwhelm the average voter, leading to disengagement or reliance on expert elites. This, critics say, undermines Rousseau's ideal of a self-legislating populace. They invoke John Stuart Mill's harm principle, which states that the only justified limit on individual liberty is to prevent harm to others. Mill's principle, situated between Hobbes's absolute sovereignty and Rousseau's popular sovereignty, suggests a more moderate approach. The state may intervene to prevent harm, but it should otherwise leave individuals free to pursue their own ends. In this sense, Mill offers a counterpoint that both Hobbes and Rousseau must grapple with. Let us now turn to the counterarguments that have been raised against each thinker, beginning with Hobbes. Libertarian critics, such as Robert Nozick, argue that Hobbes's social contract is fundamentally flawed, because it assumes that individuals can rationally consent to surrender their rights to an all-powerful sovereign. Nozick contends that the contract is not truly voluntary, it is made under the duress of fear. If the sovereign ever fails to protect the citizens, the contract is void, yet Hobbes grants the sovereign near absolute authority even in the face of failure. Moreover, critics point out that Hobbes's narrow definition of liberty, merely the absence of external obstacles, ignores the internal dimensions of freedom, such as the capacity for self-determination, moral agency, and the pursuit of one's own conception of the good life. By reducing liberty to a mechanical lack of interference, Hobbes opens the door for the state to justify any intrusion that it deems necessary for security, even if that intrusion suppresses dissent, curtails free expression, or manipulates public opinion. In the modern context, the rise of digital authoritarianism, where governments deploy facial recognition technology, social credit scores, and AI-driven censorship, can be seen as a realization of Hobbesian tolerance for despotism in the name of security. The libertarian critique warns that once the sovereign's power is entrenched, the very mechanism that was meant to protect liberty becomes the instrument of its erosion. Rousseau's opponents, meanwhile, raise a different set of concerns. Critics such as Benjamin Constant and later, modern political scientists, argue that Rousseau's concept of the general will can be co-opted by majoritarian tyranny. If the majority decides what the common good is, minorities may be forced to obey laws that run counter to their own values, effectively silencing dissent. Constant famously distinguished between the liberty of the ancient regime, where individuals were bound to the collective, and the liberty of the modern individual, which requires protection of private rights against the state. He warned that Rousseau's emphasis on collective self-legislation could lead to a situation where the individual is subsumed under the will of the majority, losing the very autonomy that positive liberty seeks to protect. The historical anecdote of the French Revolution's reign of terror illustrates this danger. The revolutionary government claimed to act on the general will, yet it imposed draconian measures, executed dissenters, and suppressed freedoms in the name of protecting the republic. Rousseau's own writings, while advocating for popular sovereignty, did not provide a detailed mechanism for protecting minority rights within the framework of the general will. leaving a gap that critics argue makes his model impractical for large, pluralistic societies. To deepen our understanding, let us revisit the English Restoration, not merely as a political event but as a lived experience of Hobbesian theory. Imagine a London tavern in 1665, the city still reeling from the Great Plague, the streets filled with the clamor of merchants, soldiers, and beggars. The sovereign, now embodied in the restored monarchy and its expanding bureaucracy, issues proclamations that require citizens to register their homes, to pay new taxes for the upkeep of a standing army, and to submit to the authority of local constables. The presence of the constables, precursors to the modern police, creates a sense of safety that allows merchants to reopen their stalls, that lets families sleep without fearing sudden raids. Yet at the same time, the same authority is used to suppress dissenting pamphleteers, to imprison those who criticize the crown, and to enforce religious conformity. The very mechanisms that protect the public from chaos also become tools of control. This duality captures the essence of Hobbes's tolerance for despotism. The sovereign's power is justified as long as it delivers security, even if it occasionally infringes upon the freedom to speak or protest. Contrast this with a modern Swiss town during a referendum on environmental policy. Picture a small alpine village where citizens gather in the communal hall, each holding a ballot that asks whether to ban certain pesticides. The debate is vigorous, with farmers arguing for their livelihoods, environmentalists citing scientific studies, and youths invoking future generations. After a day of discussion, the community votes and the majority decides to impose a ban. The decision is not imposed by a distant parliament, it is the direct expression of the people's will. The law that emerges is obeyed because the participants perceive it as a product of their own deliberation. Here, Rousseau's positive liberty is palpable. The villagers experience freedom not as the absence of interference, but as the empowerment to shape the rules that govern their lives. The same decision, however, may be contested by a minority of farmers who feel that their economic freedom has been curtailed. The Swiss system addresses this tension through mechanisms such as compensatory subsidies, illustrating an attempt to reconcile the general will with the protection of individual interests, a nuance that Rousseau's original theory only hinted at. When we juxtapose these two narratives, the Hobbesian London of the 1660s and the Rousseauian Swiss village of today, we see the divergent pathways that political authority can take. Hobbes's sovereign is a singular, often distant, figure whose legitimacy rests on the promise of order. Rousseau's sovereign is the collective, a chorus of voices that shape law together. Yet both recognize that liberty cannot exist in a vacuum. Hobbes warns that without a strong hand, liberty devolves into chaos. Rousseau warns that without collective self-determination, liberty becomes a hollow promise that serves only the powerful. Let us now explore how these ideas intersect with John Stuart Mill's harm principle, a doctrine that seeks to mediate between the extremes of Hobbesian authoritarianism and Rousseauian majoritarianism. Mill writes, the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community, against his will, is to prevent harm to others. In a Hobbesian framework, the sovereign could invoke the harm principle to justify preemptive measures, surveillance, censorship, or even detention, on the basis that potential harm must be averted. However, Mill's principle would limit such interventions to cases where a clear, demonstrable harm to another person exists, not merely a speculative threat to societal order. In a Rousseauian setting, the general will might be interpreted as the collective determination of what constitutes harm, but the danger lies in allowing the majority to define harm in ways that suppress minority viewpoints. Thus, Mill's principle functions as a check. It insists that authority must be exercised with restraint, that the justification for curbing liberty must be precise, and that the protection of individual rights remains paramount. The contemporary debate over digital surveillance offers a fertile ground to apply these theories. Consider the argument that mass data collection by intelligence agencies is a necessary Hobbesian safeguard against terrorism. Proponents claim that the state must have the capacity to monitor communications, to track movements, to preempt attacks before they happen. They echo Hobbes's claim that the sovereign's primary duty is to secure the safety of the people, even if that requires intrusive measures. Critics invoking Mill's harm principle counter that such surveillance often lacks a direct link to preventing specific harms. Instead, it creates a climate of perpetual monitoring that chills free expression, stifles dissent, and erodes trust. From a Rousseauian perspective, one might argue that if the populace were actively involved in deciding the parameters of surveillance, through referenda, public hearings, and transparent oversight, then the policy could be seen as an expression of the general will, thereby aligning with positive liberty. Yet the practical reality is that most citizens are not consulted on these matters. Decisions are made by technocratic elites, which raises the specter of a silent sovereign that operates without the explicit consent of the governed. In another contemporary arena, the rise of participatory budgeting in cities like Porto Alegre, Brazil, demonstrates a Rousseauian impulse to bring the general will into the fiscal realm. Residents gather to decide how a portion of the municipal budget will be allocated, whether to improve public parks, fund schools, or upgrade sanitation. The process embodies the idea that citizens are not merely passive recipients of services, but active architects of policy. The freedom experienced here is not the mere ability to spend one's money without interference, but the empowerment to shape the community's priorities. Yet, the limits of this model become apparent when the budget is insufficient to meet all demands, when powerful interest groups lobby for specific projects, or when the decisions made by the community conflict with national regulations. Here, the state retains a supervisory role, ensuring that the local general will does not infringe upon broader legal frameworks, a reminder that Rousseau's model must coexist with a higher order of law, much as Mill's principle demands a balance between individual autonomy and societal constraints. Returning to Hobbes, we must also consider his influence on the development of the modern police state. The notion of a Leviathan as a bureaucratic entity, an organized, ever-watching apparatus, has its roots in Hobbes's depiction of a sovereign who must enforce laws uniformly. The establishment of professional police forces in the 19th century, first in London with the Metropolitan Police under Sir Robert Peel, was justified on the grounds of preventing disorder, protecting property, and maintaining public confidence. The famous Peelian principles, that the police are the public and the public are the police, attempt to reconcile authority with public service. Yet, critics argue that the very existence of a centralized force with the power to coerce can lead to abuses, especially when accountability mechanisms are weak. The modern debate over predictive policing algorithms, which flag certain neighborhoods as high risk based on historical data, raises the question: does the sovereign's effort to preempt crime align with Hobbes's promise of security, or does it betray the covenant by imposing external impediments on the liberty of those flagged? If liberty is merely the absence of physical restraint, then a statistical label that leads to increased police presence is a new form of impediment, one that is invisible yet deeply felt. Rousseau, for his part, offers a different lens through which to view these institutions. He would ask whether the police serve the general will or merely enforce the will of a ruling class. In his Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, Rousseau distinguishes between natural inequality, differences in strength, health, or intelligence, and moral inequality, differences that arise from social conventions and property. He warns that when the state enforces property rights without the consent of those who are disadvantaged, it entrenches moral inequality and undermines true freedom. In modern terms, this critique resonates with movements that challenge systemic bias in law enforcement, arguing that policing, as currently structured, often protects the interests of the privileged rather than the collective good. From a Rousseauian standpoint, reforms that involve community oversight, participatory decision-making, and restorative justice can be seen as attempts to align the police with the general will, thereby transforming an instrument of coercion into an expression of positive liberty. The interplay between Hobbes's absolute sovereignty and Rousseau's popular sovereignty also surfaces in the realm of international relations. The concept of a global Leviathan, as advocated by scholars like Robert Keohane, suggests that a supranational authority, perhaps the United Nations or an international court, could provide the security that nation-states cannot guarantee alone. This mirrors Hobbes's idea that a powerful sovereign is necessary to prevent the war of all against all on a planetary scale. Yet, the legitimacy of such an authority hinges on the consent of the member states, echoing Rousseau's insistence that legitimacy arises from the collective will. Critics of a global Leviathan argue that imposing uniform rules on diverse cultures violates the principle of self-determination, while proponents claim that without a strong coordinating body, global challenges like climate change, pandemics, and cyber threats remain unmanageable. The tension reflects the same balancing act that Hobbes and Rousseau grappled with: how to secure the common good without sacrificing the freedom of individuals and communities. In contemplating the practical implications of these theories, it is useful to consider an analogy from the world of medicine. Imagine a patient with a serious infection. A doctor may prescribe a potent antibiotic that carries side effects. The patient's liberty to remain untouched by medication is curtailed for the sake of health. Hobbes would argue that the state, like the doctor, must intervene decisively to protect the body politic from the infection of disorder. Rousseau, however, would stress that the patient should be fully informed, consent to the treatment, and have a say in the choice of therapy. The best outcome arises when the patient's autonomy is respected while the necessary medical intervention is administered. Similarly, a society must negotiate the extent to which the sovereign can impose constraints for security, while ensuring that citizens retain a meaningful role in shaping those constraints. To bring these ideas back to the everyday experiences of our listeners, think of the simple act of crossing a street. In a Hobbesian city with a strong police presence, there may be traffic cameras, automated ticketing, and a visible police patrol ensuring that drivers obey the rules, thereby protecting pedestrians from harm. The freedom to cross the street is preserved because external impediments, reckless drivers, are restrained. Yet, the presence of constant monitoring can feel intrusive, as if every step is being watched. In a Rousseauian community, pedestrians might gather at a town meeting to decide on traffic policies, perhaps choosing to implement shared spaces where cars and pedestrians coexist, guided by mutual respect rather than force. The freedom to cross is not just the absence of obstacles, it is the result of collective decision-making that reflects the community's values. Both scenarios aim to secure safety, but they differ fundamentally in who decides the rules and how those rules are justified. The historical anecdote of the English Civil War, which preceded Hobbes's writing, underscores the stakes of his argument. The war was not merely a clash of armies, it was a contest over the very nature of authority. The parliamentarians, seeking to limit the king's power, argued for a constitutional framework that would protect individual rights. The royalists, defending the divine right of kings, claimed that a strong monarch was essential to maintain order. Hobbes, writing after the execution of Charles I and the chaotic interregnum, concluded that any attempt to limit sovereign power too severely would inevitably plunge society back into anarchy. His solution, an undivided absolute sovereign, was a direct response to the trauma of that period. Rousseau, writing later in the Enlightenment, was inspired by the same events but arrived at the opposite conclusion: that the source of legitimate authority must lie in the collective will of the people, not in the arbitrary decree of a monarch. The French Revolution provides a complementary anecdote for Rousseau. The revolutionary assemblies sought to embody the general will, drafting the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, proclaiming liberty, equality, and fraternity. Yet as the revolution progressed, the Committee of Public Safety assumed extraordinary powers, justifying its actions as necessary to protect the nascent republic from internal and external enemies. The Reign of Terror, with its guillotine and widespread arrests, illustrates how the pursuit of the general will can mutate into a tool of oppression when the mechanisms for accountability and dissent are eroded. Rousseau's own writings, while idealistic, did not anticipate the speed at which a majority could turn into a tyrannical majority, nor did he provide a robust safeguard for dissenting minorities. This historical lesson reminds us that the implementation of positive liberty demands not only participatory structures, but also constitutional safeguards that protect individual rights against the tyranny of the majority. In the modern political landscape, the tension between Hobbesian security and Rousseauian participation is evident in debates over data privacy versus public health. During the COVID-19 pandemic, many governments introduced contact tracing apps that collected location data to identify infection clusters. Proponents argued that such measures were essential to protect lives, a Hobbesian justification that the state must intervene to prevent a health crisis. Critics, invoking both Mill's harm principle and Rousseau's emphasis on self-determination, warned that citizens were being compelled to surrender personal data without sufficient consent, potentially establishing a precedent for future intrusions. Some countries, like Germany, opted for decentralized, voluntary apps that respected user privacy, attempting to blend the Hobbesian aim of security with the Rousseauian respect for individual agency. The outcome of these policies continues to be evaluated, offering a real-time laboratory for testing the balance between authority and liberty. Another contemporary illustration is the rise of participatory budgeting in cities such as New York and Paris. Residents allocate portions of municipal budgets to projects they deem most important, whether to improve public parks, fund after-school programs, or invest in renewable energy. This practice aligns with Rousseau's vision of a law that the people prescribe for themselves, turning citizens into co-legislators rather than passive subjects. At the same time, the overarching fiscal framework, tax collection, and regulatory oversight remain under the authority of elected officials, preserving a Hobbesian layer of centralized control necessary to maintain the city's overall stability and financial health. The success of these initiatives suggests that a hybrid model, where a sovereign authority ensures security and order while providing avenues for popular participation, may offer a pragmatic path forward. In reflecting on these myriad examples, we can see that Hobbes and Rousseau are not simply historical footnotes, but living interlocutors in our ongoing conversation about how societies should be organized. Hobbes reminds us that without a strong, coherent authority, the fabric of social life can unravel into violence, that liberty without security may be a hollow promise. Rousseau reminds us that authority devoid of popular consent can become oppressive, that true freedom is found in the capacity to shape the rules that govern us. Both thinkers acknowledge the necessity of some form of constraint, but they diverge on where that constraint should originate and how it should be justified. The question then becomes, can we synthesize these insights into a coherent political philosophy for the 21st century? One possibility is to envision a layered governance structure. At the base, local communities engage in direct democratic practices, town meetings, referenda, participatory budgeting, embodying Rousseau's positive liberty. Above them, a national sovereign, an elected parliament, a constitutional court, provides the security apparatus, the rule of law, and the capacity to respond to threats that transcend local boundaries, echoing Hobbes's emphasis on a powerful authority. The two layers are linked by constitutional guarantees that protect individual rights, by transparent oversight mechanisms, and by a culture of civic education that encourages citizens to understand both their responsibilities and their entitlements. In such a model, the sovereign's power is limited not merely by the absence of external impediments, but by the presence of a vibrant, participatory civil society that continually redefines the general will. To bring this vision to life, imagine a city where the police force operates under a community review board elected by residents, where data collected by surveillance cameras is anonymized and stored only with the explicit consent of the neighborhood, where citizens can vote quarterly on budget allocations for public safety, and where any law that threatens to curtail civil liberties must be passed through a national referendum. In this scenario, the Hobbesian need for security is met by a professional, accountable police force. The Rousseauian desire for self-legislation is satisfied by regular, meaningful referenda. Mill's harm principle serves as a legal check that any restriction must be demonstrably aimed at preventing concrete harm. The result is a dynamic equilibrium, a constant negotiation between the necessity of order and the aspiration for freedom. Yet such an equilibrium is fragile. It requires vigilance, education, and a shared commitment to the principle that authority is a trust, not a right. It demands that citizens remain engaged, that institutions be transparent, and that the rule of law be applied consistently. As we look to the future, the challenges of artificial intelligence, climate change, and global migration will test the limits of both Hobbesian and Rousseauian frameworks. Will we grant ever greater powers to a sovereign to manage complex, borderless threats, thereby risking a slide toward a digital despotism? Or will we empower citizens to shape the policies that affect their lives, risking gridlock and inefficiency in a world that demands swift action? The answers will likely lie somewhere in between, informed by the insights of both thinkers and guided by the enduring principle that liberty, in its fullest sense, is both the absence of undue restraint and the presence of meaningful participation. In closing, let us return to the words of Hobbes, who wrote, "Covenants without the sword are but words," and to Rousseau, who declared, "The strongest is never strong enough to be free without the consent of the weak." These two statements, seemingly opposed, together capture the paradox at the heart of political authority. That power must be both enforced and consented to, that security must be balanced with participation, that liberty must be protected from both the chaos of anarchy and the tyranny of the majority. As we navigate the complexities of our own age, watching drones hover over city squares, filling out ballots on smartphones, debating the scope of governmental power, we are, in effect, continuing the conversation that Hobbes and Rousseau began centuries ago. Their ideas remain our guideposts, reminding us that the quest for a just and free society is an ongoing negotiation, a dance between the sovereign's sword and the people's voice, a perpetual effort to craft a world where security and liberty are not enemies, but partners in the shared project of humanity. When we turn our gaze to the legacies of Thomas Hobbes and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, we find two towering silhouettes that continue to shape the contours of modern political thought, each casting a shadow that stretches across centuries, across continents, across the very way we imagine the relationship between the individual and the state. It is tempting to reduce their contributions to a simple binary, Hobbes the authoritarian, Rousseau the romantic idealist. But such a reduction would betray the richness of their arguments, the depth of their influence, and the complexity of the critiques that have risen to meet them. Let us then walk together through the corridors of their ideas, pause at the doors of their most enduring impacts, and listen to the voices of contemporary scholars who still argue over the balance between security and freedom, between order and liberty. Consider first the world that Hobbes inherited. The English Civil War had torn apart the old order, leaving a nation in a state of violent uncertainty. In the midst of that chaos, Hobbes wrote Leviathan, declaring that the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, was the natural condition of humanity when stripped of the protective umbrella of sovereign power. His central claim that a strong, indivisible sovereign is necessary to escape the war of all against all has become a cornerstone of legal positivism. By insisting that the legitimacy of law rests not on moral considerations but on the command of a sovereign authority, Hobbes laid the groundwork for a view of law as a system of rules imposed from above, a view that later scholars such as H.L. Hart would refine but never fully escape from. The echo of Hobbes's command theory can be heard in modern statutes that derive their force simply because they have been enacted by a recognized authority, regardless of whether they align with any higher moral principle. From the realm of domestic law, Hobbes's thought spilled into the field of international relations, giving rise to what we now call political realism. If the state of nature is a battlefield of competing interests, then the international arena, lacking a global Leviathan, must also be understood as a realm of power politics, where states act primarily out of self-preservation. Think of the Cold War, where the United States and the Soviet Union navigated a precarious balance of terror, each seeking to maximize its security in an anarchic world. Realist scholars such as Hans J. Morgenthau repeatedly invoked Hobbesian logic to argue that moral considerations must be subordinated to the imperative of survival. Even today, when analysts discuss the rise of China or the resurgence of nationalist movements, they often do so through a Hobbesian lens, asking whether the international system can ever be tamed by a higher authority, or whether we must accept perpetual competition as the natural order. Hobbes's influence did not stop at the abstract realm of theory. His ideas seeped into the very architecture of constitutional design. The notion that a sovereign must be endowed with sufficient power to enforce peace informed the drafting of many modern constitutions, from the United States to post-war Japan. In particular, scholars trace a line from Hobbes's advocacy of a strong executive to the development of the modern welfare state. The paradox is striking. Hobbes, who seemed to champion an almost despotic ruler, is invoked by contemporary welfare theorists to justify a state that intervenes in the market, provides social safety nets, and in a sense protects citizens from the state of nature of economic insecurity. The argument runs that without a robust public authority capable of redistributing resources, citizens remain vulnerable to the brutal competition that Hobbes described. Thus, the welfare state can be seen as a peaceful embodiment of the Leviathan, a protective shell that shields individuals from the harshness of unregulated markets. Two recent, concrete examples illustrate how Hobbesian reasoning resurfaces in the public sphere. The first is the justification of emergency powers during the COVID-19 pandemic. Governments around the world invoked the need for a strong, centralized response to a crisis that threatened public health, a modern manifestation of the war of all against all, this time fought with masks, vaccines, and lockdowns rather than swords. In the United Kingdom, the Coronavirus Act 2020 granted ministers sweeping powers to restrict movement, close businesses, and enforce quarantines. Proponents argued, echoing Hobbes, that only a decisive sovereign could impose the order necessary to prevent societal collapse. Critics, of course, warned that such powers risked eroding civil liberties, a tension that lies at the heart of Hobbes's own paradox. The very authority that secures peace can become a threat to the freedom it is meant to protect. The second example lies far beyond national borders, in the corridors of the United Nations Security Council. The Council's authority to authorize collective action, including sanctions and military interventions, rests on the premise that a limited group of states can act as a global Leviathan, imposing order on an otherwise anarchic international system. When the Council passed resolutions to intervene in Libya in 2011, for instance, it invoked the responsibility to protect civilians, a moral imperative that nevertheless relied on Hobbesian logic. Without a central authority, the world would descend into chaos. Yet the very structure of the Council, permanent members with veto power, mirrors the concentration of authority Hobbes championed, while also exposing the fragility of a system where a single dissent can stall decisive action. The debate over the Council's legitimacy continues to echo Hobbes's question: can peace be secured without surrendering some degree of sovereignty? Turning now to Rousseau, we encounter a different historical moment. The Enlightenment had already begun to question the divine right of kings, but it was Rousseau's social contract that offered a radical reimagining of political legitimacy. Authority derives not from the power of a ruler, but from the collective will of the people, the general will. Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains, he wrote, a line that has resonated through centuries of revolutionary fervor. Rousseau's insistence that legitimate law must express the common interest of citizens, rather than the arbitrary will of a sovereign, fed directly into the Romantic movement's celebration of authenticity, emotion, and the natural goodness of humanity. Poets and artists from William Wordsworth to Caspar David Friedrich drew upon Rousseau's vision of a return to nature as a source of moral renewal, a theme that would later blossom into environmental ethics. Rousseau's influence on modern environmental thought is perhaps one of the most striking and unexpected legacies of an 18th-century philosopher. His notion of the state of nature as a harmonious condition, unspoiled by the corrupting influence of civilization, provides a powerful metaphor for contemporary eco-politics. When activists speak of rewilding or of restoring ecosystems to a pre-industrial baseline, they are invoking a Rousseauian imagination of a world where humans live in balance with the earth, rather than in domination over it. The Earth Charter, adopted in 2000, reflects this spirit, asserting that the earth is the common home of humanity and calling for policies that respect ecological limits, a clear echo of Rousseau's belief that the social contract must align with the natural order. Another vivid illustration of Rousseau's impact can be found in the drafting of the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen in 1789. The Revolutionary Assembly drew heavily on Rousseau's ideas, especially the principle that sovereignty resides in the nation and that laws must be an expression of the general will. The opening article of the Declaration proclaims, "Men are born and remain free and equal in rights," a phrase that mirrors Rousseau's famous opening of the social contract. The document's emphasis on popular sovereignty, civic participation, and the right to resist oppression can be read as a direct translation of Rousseau's theoretical framework into concrete political language, a transformation that set the stage for modern democratic constitutions worldwide. Rousseau's legacy also extends into theories of participatory democracy, where citizens are not merely voters but active contributors to policy deliberation. Contemporary scholars such as Carol Pateman and Arkan Fung have built upon Rousseau's notion of the general will to argue for deliberative forums, citizen assemblies, and participatory budgeting processes. In Porto Alegre, Brazil, for example, the municipal government instituted a participatory budgeting system that invites ordinary residents to decide how public funds are allocated. This practice resonates with Rousseau's vision of a polity where the collective decision-making process reflects the common interest, not the preferences of a distant elite. The success of such experiments has spurred similar initiatives in cities across Europe and North America, suggesting that Rousseau's ideas continue to inspire concrete mechanisms for democratic engagement. Yet both Hobbes and Rousseau have not escaped the critical scrutiny of later thinkers, particularly those who foreground gender and colonial dimensions. Feminist scholars have long challenged the gendered assumptions embedded in both philosophers' accounts of the social contract. In the case of Hobbes, feminist critics such as Carol Pateman point out that his model of a sovereign who commands obedience presupposes a patriarchal hierarchy, where the sovereign is imagined as a male figure exerting authority over a passive populace. The very language of Leviathan, a monstrous sea creature, conjures images of masculine domination. Moreover, Hobbes's dismissal of women's capacity for rational deliberation, reflected in his occasional references to women as naturally weaker, has been highlighted as an exclusionary premise that undergirds a political theory that privileges male authority. Rousseau, despite his championing of popular sovereignty, has also faced feminist critique for his portrayal of women. In his Émile, Rousseau outlines a separate sphere for women, arguing that their education should aim to make them pleasing and subservient to the male head of household. Feminist philosophers such as Susan Mahler-Akin have argued that this vision of gender differentiation undermines the universalist claims of the general will by embedding a structural inequality within the very fabric of the social contract. The tension between Rousseau's call for universal freedom and his prescription for gendered roles illustrates a paradox that contemporary feminist theorists continue to unpack. Post-colonial critiques add another layer of complexity to the assessment of both thinkers. Edward Said's analysis of Orientalism, while not directly targeting Hobbes or Rousseau, opens a methodological window for questioning the Eurocentric premises that underlie much of Enlightenment political thought. Hobbes's description of the state of nature, for instance, assumes a universal human condition that neglects the lived realities of peoples living under different social formations, such as tribal societies in Africa or the Americas. Critics like Homi K. Babha argue that Hobbes's universalism erases the particularities of non-European experiences, thereby justifying colonial domination under the guise of bringing order to a chaotic nature. Rousseau's romanticized vision of the noble savage has been similarly problematized. While his idealization of pre-civilized humanity appears to celebrate the dignity of non-European peoples, it simultaneously reduces them to a mythic abstraction, stripping them of agency and historical specificity. Post-colonial scholars contend that this trope can be appropriated to justify paternalistic interventions, as colonizers claim to protect the supposedly pure and vulnerable natives from the corrupting influence of modernity. In both cases, the universal claims of Hobbes and Rousseau, whether about sovereignty or natural goodness, have been wielded, consciously or unconsciously, to legitimize European expansion and domination. To understand how contemporary political theorists grapple with these inheritances, we must look to thinkers who have attempted to synthesize, critique, or move beyond Hobbesian and Rousseauian frameworks. John Rawls, for instance, engages directly with both. In his theory of justice, Rawls adopts a Hobbesian original position as a hypothetical veil of ignorance, a device designed to strip away personal biases, but he also embraces Rousseau's commitment to the common good by insisting that principles of justice must be chosen by free and equal citizens. Rawls's difference principle, which permits social and economic inequalities only if they benefit the least advantaged, can be read as a modern attempt to reconcile the need for a strong, ordering authority, a nod to Hobbes with the egalitarian aspirations of the general will, a nod to Rousseau. Rawls's influence on contemporary constitutional design, especially in welfare state contexts, demonstrates how Hobbes's and Rousseau's ideas continue to be reinterpreted in the pursuit of a just society. Hannah Arendt offers another perspective, especially on the tension between security and freedom. In her seminal work The Human Condition, Arendt critiques the Hobbesian focus on security as the primary end of political life, warning that an overemphasis on safety can lead to the erosion of the public sphere and the rise of totalitarianism. She contrasts this with Rousseau's emphasis on active participation, arguing that true freedom emerges not from the mere absence of threat, but from the capacity to act together in concert. Arendt's analysis of the banality of evil during the Holocaust underscores how bureaucratic mechanisms, often justified by a Hobbesian desire for order, can suppress individual judgment and moral responsibility. Her reflections invite us to question whether modern societies, in invoking emergency powers or security councils, risk slipping into a Hobbesian night where liberty is sacrificed on the altar of safety. Contemporary political theorists debating the balance between security and freedom often invoke the very scenarios we mentioned earlier, pandemic emergency powers, UN interventions, to illustrate the stakes of their arguments. The philosopher Michael Walzer, for instance, argues that a Hobbesian approach to security can be justified in extreme circumstances, but only if it is subject to democratic oversight and limited in duration. In contrast, the political theorist Nancy Fraser emphasizes the importance of participatory mechanisms, echoing Rousseau, to ensure that security measures do not become tools of oppression. Their dialogue reflects a broader intellectual current that seeks to navigate between the extremes of absolute authority and unfettered liberty, a dialectic that Hobbes and Rousseau themselves set in motion. When we examine the modern welfare state, we see Hobbesian foundations woven into its fabric. The idea that the state must possess the coercive power to tax, to redistribute, and to enforce social programs rests on the belief that without a strong central authority, society would revert to competition and poverty, a modern state of nature of economic insecurity. Yet the very design of many welfare systems also incorporates Rousseauian elements, participatory budgeting, citizen panels, and social dialogues that aim to capture the general will of the populace in shaping public policy. In Scandinavia, for example, the extensive use of citizen consultations in the development of health and education reforms reflects an attempt to harmonize Hobbes's need for order with Rousseau's demand for democratic legitimacy. The United Nations Security Council, as a global embodiment of Hobbesian authority, also reveals Rousseauian tensions. While the Council is empowered to maintain international peace, its composition, 5 permanent members with veto power, has been challenged by calls for a more democratic, representative structure. Nations in the Global South argue that the current arrangement reflects a Euro-American monopoly on global decision-making, reminiscent of the colonial critiques we discussed. Proposals for reform often invoke Rousseau's idea of the general will on an international scale, suggesting that a more inclusive body could better represent the collective interests of humanity. Yet skeptics warn that without a decisive authority, the Council could become paralyzed, leading back to the anarchy that Hobbes warned against. The debate thus becomes a living illustration of the philosophical tension between order and participation. In the realm of environmental politics, Rousseau's romanticized state of nature continues to inspire movements that seek to align human societies with ecological limits. The degrowth movement, for instance, argues that perpetual economic expansion is incompatible with the planet's finite resources, invoking Rousseau's critique of artificial wants that drive societies away from natural simplicity. Proponents cite his assertion that the first man who, having enclosed a piece of land, thought of saying "this is mine," is the founder of civil society. This line is used to critique private property regimes that enable environmental exploitation, suggesting that a return to a more communal, nature-aligned arrangement could restore a form of the original general will, one that respects ecological balance. Critics, however, point out that Rousseau's own acceptance of private property as a necessary component of civil society creates a paradox that contemporary eco-politics must navigate. Conversely, Hobbes's perspective is invoked by those who argue that strong state intervention is necessary to address climate change. The rationale is that only a sovereign with the authority to enforce emission standards, levy carbon taxes, and mobilize resources on a massive scale can overcome the collective action problem that climate change presents. In this sense, the state becomes a modern Leviathan, capable of coordinating action that individual actors, left to their own devices, would fail to achieve. The tension between this Hobbesian approach and the Rousseauian emphasis on grassroots participation is evident in debates over climate policy. Should the solution be top-down regulation, or should it emerge from community-driven initiatives and participatory planning? The answer, perhaps, lies in a hybrid model that draws on both thinkers, a strong, accountable authority that also empowers citizens to shape the policies that affect their environment. The French Declaration of the Rights of Man, while rooted in Rousseau's philosophy, also contains echoes of Hobbesian concerns for order. Article 3 declares that the principle of all sovereignty resides essentially in the nation, a Rousseauian affirmation of popular sovereignty. Yet the same document includes provisions that grant the state the power to ensure public order and protect property, reflecting a Hobbesian acknowledgement that liberty must be balanced with security. This duality illustrates how revolutionary texts can synthesize seemingly opposed ideas, creating a constitutional framework that seeks to protect both the freedom of the individual and the stability of the collective. Modern feminist scholars have taken up this duality to argue for a reimagining of the social contract that integrates gender equity into both the sovereign's authority and the general will. Scholars such as Carol Pateman and Susan Mahler-Akin propose a gendered social contract that redefines the terms of political agreement to include women's voices as equal participants, thereby challenging the patriarchal underpinnings of both Hobbesian and Rousseauian models. They ask, what would a Leviathan look like if it were accountable to a truly inclusive electorate, and what would the general will be if it were formed without the exclusion of half the population? These questions push contemporary political theory beyond the confines of 17th and 18th century thought, urging us to reconstruct the foundations of authority and participation in ways that reflect the diversity of modern societies. Post-colonial thinkers, too, have offered transformative reinterpretations. Frantz Fanon, in The Wretched of the Earth, critiques the civilizing mission that Hobbesian order often justified, exposing how the imposition of a sovereign's law can become a tool of oppression for colonized peoples. Fanon's analysis suggests that the Leviathan, when exported beyond its original European context, can become a mechanism of domination rather than protection. Similarly, scholars such as Gayatri Spivak have interrogated Rousseau's noble savage as a form of romanticized othering that erases the agency of colonized subjects. By foregrounding the voices of those historically silenced, post-colonial critiques compel us to re-examine the universal claims of both philosophers, asking whether their ideas can be adapted to a pluralistic world that acknowledges multiple epistemologies and forms of governance. In contemporary political debates, the balance between security and freedom remains a live issue, especially as technology reshapes the parameters of both. The rise of digital surveillance, justified by governments as necessary to combat terrorism or pandemics, evokes Hobbesian arguments for a sovereign that can monitor and control to preserve order. Yet the backlash from civil rights advocates, who invoke Rousseau's insistence on participatory oversight, highlights the enduring relevance of the general will as a check on state power. The philosopher Michel Foucault's notion of biopower extends Hobbes's ideas into the realm of governing populations through data, while also warning of the dangers of a society where individuals become subjects of constant observation. In this digital age, the conversation between Hobbes and Rousseau takes on new dimensions, prompting us to ask, how can we design institutions that protect public health and safety without surrendering the democratic agency that defines our humanity? The dialogue between Rawls, Arendt, and contemporary scholars such as Amartya Sen further enriches this conversation. Sen's capability approach, which emphasizes the real freedoms individuals have to achieve well-being, resonates with Rousseau's vision of a society that enables individuals to fulfill their potential, while also acknowledging Hobbes's concern for the material conditions that make such freedom possible. Sen argues that without a robust social safety net, an institutional embodiment of Hobbesian order, people cannot exercise the capabilities that constitute genuine liberty. This synthesis illustrates how modern thinkers weave together the threads of security and participation, constructing a tapestry that honors both the need for protective authority and the imperative of democratic empowerment. When we examine the practical implementation of these ideas, we see that many contemporary governments adopt a hybrid model. In Germany, for example, the Basic Law Grundgesetz establishes a strong constitutional court that can limit executive power, reflecting Hobbesian caution against arbitrary rule, while also guaranteeing extensive participatory rights, such as the right to petition and to engage in public debate, echoing Rousseau. During the COVID-19 crisis, the German government invoked emergency powers but did so under the oversight of the Bundestag and the Federal Constitutional Court, seeking to balance the need for swift action with the protection of democratic processes. This approach illustrates how modern constitutionalism can draw on both philosophers, attempting to harness the strengths of each while mitigating their excesses. In the realm of international law, the International Criminal Court, ICC, represents another attempt to fuse Hobbesian authority with Rousseauian legitimacy. The ICC's mandate to prosecute crimes against humanity reflects a belief that a supranational authority is necessary to enforce order in a world where sovereign states may fail to hold perpetrators accountable, a Hobbesian justification for a global Leviathan. Yet the court's reliance on the consent of states, its emphasis on victim participation, and its efforts to incorporate restorative justice principles all draw on Rousseau's insistence that legitimacy arises from the collective will of those affected. The ongoing debates about the ICC's jurisdiction and its perceived bias highlight the challenges of constructing an institution that can command authority while remaining accountable to a diverse global constituency. The conversation also extends into education and civic culture. Programs that teach deliberative democracy in schools, inspired by Rousseau's emphasis on the formation of the general will, aim to cultivate citizens who can think critically about collective decisions. At the same time, curricula that stress the rule of law, the importance of institutions, and the necessity of social order echo Hobbes's warning that without a shared framework, society risks descending into conflict. By integrating both perspectives, educators hope to nurture individuals who appreciate both the protective function of the state and the moral responsibility of active participation. Finally, we must consider how future challenges may reshape the relevance of Hobbes and Rousseau. Climate change, artificial intelligence, and global pandemics present problems that transcend national borders, demanding coordination on a scale that Hobbes might have deemed impossible without a world Leviathan, yet also requiring the consent and involvement of diverse populations, a Rousseauian demand for legitimacy. The question that looms before us is whether we can forge new social contracts that synthesize the strengths of both thinkers, creating institutions powerful enough to address existential threats, yet permeated with mechanisms that ensure those institutions remain responsive to the general will of humanity. As we look ahead, the voices of Rawls, Arendt, Sen, and countless others remind us that the task of political philosophy is never complete. It is a perpetual negotiation between order and freedom, authority and participation, the Leviathan and the general will. In closing, the legacies of Hobbes and Rousseau are not static monuments but living dialogues that continue to inform, challenge, and inspire. Their ideas have been woven into the fabric of legal positivism, international realism, welfare state theory, romanticism, environmental ethics, and participatory democracy. They have been invoked to justify emergency powers during pandemics, to empower the United Nations Security Council, to shape the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, and to energize eco-political movements that call for a return to a more harmonious relationship with nature. At the same time, feminist and post-colonial critiques have exposed the gendered and Eurocentric blind spots that linger in their theories, urging us to revise and expand their frameworks. Contemporary philosophers, Rawls, Arendt, Sen, Pateman, and many others, continue to wrestle with the balance between security and freedom, offering fresh syntheses that seek to honor the insights of both Hobbes and Rousseau while addressing the demands of a complex, interconnected world. Thus, as we reflect on the enduring impact of these two great minds, we are invited to ask ourselves, how will we, in our own time, negotiate the tension between the need for a strong, protective authority and the imperative to give voice to every citizen? Will we allow the Leviathan to dominate, or will we cultivate a general will that truly includes all? The answers we craft today will become the foundations upon which future generations build their own social contracts, and in that sense, the conversation that began in the 17th and 18th centuries remains as vital as ever. Let us listen, let us debate, and let us strive to shape a world where security and liberty, order and participation, are not opposing forces but complementary strands of a shared, evolving tapestry.